Priyanka, officially welcome to
Thank you
the
so much.
Performance Formula podcast. It's so good to have you here. You are my first guest from India. I've
Oh,
never
wow.
had a guest from India on the podcast. I've always wanted sort of to explore the world of performance with somebody from India. And so I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Jody. It's such an honor to actually be here with you, and I think we can definitely explore a lot of aspects around performance, as we move forward in the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that stood out for me, as I said to you in my communication with you, with your sort of expertise, is that you seem to have been working with high-level athletes in India, in
Mm-hmm.
particular, I think in the field of hockey, as
Mm-hmm.
well as you have an angle on the family uh, or expertise in family, And so so often we get, um, as coaches especially, we deal with both of those. We deal with parents, we deal with children. They go back to their homes, they go back to their families. And there is this dynamic, I think, that's always at play that we're not always aware of, right? And so I'm wondering if you could sort of share with us where your head is at with that. How do you make sense of the impact families and sort of the dynamics that's at play there impacts performance?
Mm, I think, especially in the field of performance, sports and performance psychology, we generally look at it like, it's mainly the confidence of an athlete which is actually having an impact. Or probably we look at it like he's distracted, he's not able to focus. Or, we look at it in terms of probably that, he doesn't really have the support, he's not communicating with the athletes. We basically look at performance in these categories, but I feel I look at it very differently, mainly because of the training I've had probably when it comes to working in the field of family. So I look at an individual as a person who, when a person goes out there to play, an athlete goes out there to play, he is not just going individually. He comes with a lot of life experiences. So, of course, he has his parents within him, his ancestry within him. And I think all those things actually have an impact on the performance rather than just looking at it like, it's just his confidence or his concentration. So, there's much more to performance than just categorizing it, is what I feel. I'm not saying you can't work that way, but there's also this way, which is also a broad way of looking at performance.
Mhm. Yeah, so when you're speaking there, I sort of the distinction I make in my head, and hopefully I've got it right. I'm going to use different words. It's almost like you speak about the clinical side of psychology, where it's very much about the confidence, the motivation, how distracted are you, how focused are you,
Yeah.
versus the holistic nature of being a human being. That we are this multifaceted creature,
Yeah.
so as to say, without saying it
I think you got it right.
yeah. So if you think of, say, the work that you do, right, how would you use that? How would you use that understanding when you get to working with an athlete, or with a
Hmm.
team, so as to speak?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, like I said, there are so many times that when an athlete probably is burdened, especially on the field, I also look at it in terms of what is the dynamic that is happening back in the family that might be affecting or causing this burden, especially that the athlete is feeling in the field of performance, right? Like for example, there are times, let's say it's a tennis player, or any team sport, or basically a mixed doubles, any of the things. Sometimes generally what happens is, athlete is feeling that, what, this person isn't doing enough, I'm taking a lot of load, etc., etc. And when you actually look at it, especially from a very systemic perspective, it could also be something around the family that is happening, where the person is taking on a load
Mm.
from the parent, and that is also getting reflected on this in the field of performance to a very large extent. So I would look at it this way and also explore it this way. um right,
Yeah.
like for example, I mean, I was training systemic and penalty constellation, which was developed by Bert Hellinger. He was a German psychotherapist. So basically, he speaks about the orders in the family, right? So basically, he speaks about the fact that parents come first and then the children come. So sometimes what happens is the order can be changed. Like sometimes what happens is like children end up becoming parents and they end up parenting the children. So when those things happen, that dynamic also gets affected in the field of sports and performance, quite a bit. So you may see that, they're not looking at teammates as equal to them as players. They may end up looking at them as children or feel that, they're not competent enough. They're weak. So that's also because children end up taking on the position of parents. And that's something that they've done in their own family system. And what they have done within their family system ends up having an impact even in their, immediate surroundings. It could be teams, it could be organizations, it could be anything else. So this dynamic does play out quite a bit.
I mean, my head's going in a lot of different places here, so I've got to think where I want to go first, right? So
Okay.
I'm thinking at first. So firstly, I'm thinking of my own dynamic within my own family and my own son. I think it's quite natural for us all to reflect on ourselves and where we're at first, right? And I think of sort of the family we've built, and at times I think it's different, right? It is a little bit different because my wife and I, we only have one son. He's not my own son. His real dad passed away when he was 6 weeks old, and I met him when he was 2.5. And I think the dynamic in our family is very much that he's included in everything. So from a very young age, we've made him so much part of the family that we treat him very much as an equal. My experience of that, having not been raised like that in my own right? I was sort of raised in the Afrikaans culture in South Africa is that the parents is your authority. As a child, you just have to submit to everything. And my experience of that wasn't necessarily the best because I didn't make good sense of everything. Where with my son, we sort of broke down maybe some of those barriers. I'm still his dad, and I think he understands the perception of that, right? He's not the boss, or he's not parenting me, or any of that sort of thing, but he's very much seen as an equal within our family. And then my head sort of also goes to the other side, which is, I get that, right? You see this potential dynamic play off in teams where some team members might sit back a little bit and sort of be weak in inverted commas, because they might not be weak, but it's how they've sort of learned to be. And then some might be a little bit more senior or a little bit more bossy or a little bit more authoritative. And I'd never put the pieces together that could actually be happening in their family already,
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, right? I mean, I look at some of the teams I'm involved with, and there's some parents that are, or let me rather just ask the question like this, right? What in your mind would be a good parent from a sporting point of view? And I don't know if that's a great question to ask, but if we consider the sort of that there's all these dynamics at play potentially, like what would be good parenting within a sporting context?
I mean, good and bad is a very difficult distinction to make, isn't it? I think parents are actually trying their best, possible from their understanding to give their child what is best for them. And also their own, the way they have been brought up does have an impact on the ways, they're out there supporting their child. Ideally, of course, I would say that, it would be very nice if they're more supportive. But then there are, of course, a lot of times that we see that parents also create a lot of pressure for children, especially the young ones or even the older ones. I feel that when they go out there and play and they expect them to perform, sometimes what happens is I think parents end up giving mixed messages. They say that, no matter how you perform, I am with you. But then they also give a message saying that, what, you have to do well. So basically, it can be quite confusing for the children. And, because it's like, are you supporting me or are you pressurizing me? So there can be that confusion and that conflict in the child's head, especially about what do I make sense of this? So I would definitely say that, like sport is a very new environment, especially when they're children are put into the sport, just like school, it's a very new thing for them. Um, and they may also be very insecure around it. So I think it's important to create a very safe and secure environment and appreciate them, validate them as much as possible so that, they go out there and give their best. So I think creating a very safe and secure environment is ideal.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Mm.
And also help them deal with the performance pressure when it comes to it.
Mm. Is there things that parents could be actively doing that would make their environment more safe and secure? Is there like one or two things that you'd say, if you did these two things, that would make your environment definitely more safe and secure? And if you did these two things, maybe there's more, it would make it definitely unsafe, or less safe.
I think it would be nice if parents could actually work on themselves and heal their own wounds, because then they would create a very safe environment for the children and for the younger ones or any of the athletes for that matter. Because then they will be triggering their children less, is what I feel. That's ideally the situation.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
apart from that, I think regulating emotional regulation is one thing that I would definitely recommend for parents. When they learn to regulate their own emotions, they'll be more present for their children. It would be really nice.
Yeah. I hear you on that, right? Personally, I've walked we've met on this call for the first time. I've walked a long, long road with my emotions, from not being aware of them at all to being aware, to not knowing what to do with them, to being able to choose the right emotions at the right times, to feeling things and not knowing why you're feeling them. So I can certainly see the benefit in that, right? That because I think we are the examples at the end of the day, right? We're the examples to our children. And so if we can be better as parents with that, then that helps us. Would my assumption be correct that you're sort of pointing towards that? Let's say there's a competitive event, any sport, cricket, rugby, tennis, golf, doesn't matter. And the parent is, say, standing next to the field. If they've dealt with their own emotions, or not regulate, or if they've got the ability to regulate their own emotions, rather, are you suggesting that in like moments like that, maybe a tight moment in the competition, they'll be different, and therefore they'll be treating their child different because they're sort of, maybe their emotions are flaring up, but they can sort of put them in the right context and still calmly speak with their child, versus they feel this emotion and they have an outburst towards their child. Is that sort of what you're alluding to as an example?
I think that is one of thing is what I understand. I think the child will also realize and learn to rely on the parents more if the parents end up working on their own emotions. Because if parents are unpredictable, then the children are confused quite a bit in terms of, okay, I don't know how my parent is going to react for this. Did I do the right thing? Did I not do the right things? And that conflict can happen in the head. More than the performance, I think that they focus on the parents' reaction more also. But I think if it's a consistent thing, they know that, okay, my parent is available for me no matter what, but love that, that they have for me is not going to shift irrespective of what happens to the performance. So I think that consistently needs to be shown rather than just doing it one time or, because then the child doesn't know because he's used to seeing different mixed up emotions.
Okay, I get that. And I think that's great advice, right? It is your consistency as a parent with your behavior that creates then the safe environment for your child, so that ultimately they can be better at performing and knowing that you're not going to be in a certain way because you are consistently in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you think of sort of the psychology behind this, right? And I actually don't think I know if I have an answer to this question myself. But if you think of the psychology behind the whole dynamic of being a parent, is there, like, I mean, for me, performance psychology is fairly easy, right? It is the things that, well, I say easy, but it is the sort of things. It's normally the confidence, the motivation, the focus. If we just talk purely performance, it's your ability to be present as an example. Is there like key psychological things for parents to be aware of in that same sort of way, or not really? Is it very much on each individual and their personality?
I think one is for the parents to also believing in their parenting. That is one thing that I have seen in a lot of parents.
Mm,
Sometimes they're very doubtful whether they are good parents.
mm,
So I think for them to believe that they're good parents is very essential.
mm,
Um, because sometimes, I mean, of course, they do react. Certain things comes out which are not meant to come out, especially even with their children. But I think that they need to believe in their basic goodness, that they're doing a good job. And of course, there's a lot of pressure even on parents if you look at it, right? There's so much of work commitments. And with the way families are right now, it is, we've drifted quite a bit towards nuclear families. So having support from other family members is very, very less. So, parents have to do everything for
mm,
the children. I think they really have to see their strength that they are doing the best possible thing for their child
mm,
rather than doubting their capacity or even thinking whether they're good enough for their children.
mm,
I think that's very important for parents to remember most of the times.
mm. I think that could be a good sort of frame because it sets up that I'm always trying to do the good thing. If I
No.
believe that I'm good in my parenting, as an example,
Mm,
then it would be constantly sort of checking, well, is this what I'm busy doing good for my child? And I can imagine
yeah.
that that has a positive benefit and effect. What is a nuclear family? When you use that word,
I mean, to say that, the families, the joint family system where you have your grandparents,
hmm?
we've shifted quite a lot from that, right? It's basically like you just have your parents and the children right now. So that is what
Okay,
I mean by the nuclear family setup right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's something I definitely notice, and I mean, I've now been fortunate enough to work with some Indian families, and I obviously know the South African system. And
Mm.
within South Africa, the Afrikaans community in particular, the parenting style there, I think there's a lot of similarities between that and at times my perception of the Indian parents, where it's a little bit more strict, a little
Yeah.
bit more like mom and dad is the boss or the authority in the household,
Yes.
and a lot of what you have to do as a child is almost to please your parents to a certain
Mm.
extent. I know
Yeah.
within the Indian community, especially when it comes to later studies in life, there's very specific paths that parents want children to walk. Maybe that's not quite the same in the Afrikaans community, but there's definitely I see the similarities, right? And I mean, I was raised like that to a certain
Oh,
extent. Personally, like I said before, I didn't enjoy the experience. It wasn't for me personally an enjoyable one. And so there's this idea in the world, and I think if you look around politics, all of that, we seem to be all drifting more into our own little worlds, where it's just me against me myself against the world, and I try and lift myself up. Versus, I think this idea of if there's grandparents and there's extended family, and it creates more a sense of community. I see a lot of value in that, right? That there's
yes.
different stories and different inputs, and almost there's like checks and balances. I think on parents and on kids. If I do this,
Yeah.
my granddad's upset. If I do that, my mom's upset. If I do that, my dad gets upset. But you've maybe got the wise old sage in the grandfather that's speaking to the parents and the kids as an example. And so I think we lose some of that, right? In the modern world, we lose
Yeah.
that the benefit from having that sort of extended thing. Yeah. If you think of the work you do or have done with, say, within sports teams, right? Um, what would you say is like the primary um, things that you felt athletes needed, right?
Mm.
And I mean, it could include some of the parenting things that we've spoken about so far, or it could be sort of different things. What was some of their primary challenges when it came to performance within those environments?
I think more or less a lot of athletes, from the young ones to the older ones, it there's a lot of pressure around performance. It's like I have to be the best. I really want to do my best, or it could be a lot around mistakes. or wanting to win and excluding the losses, you know. I think these are some of the common things which I have seen in athletes, that, a lot of competitive anxiety.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Have you got like any go-to strategies or things like that you would use? I mean, there's a couple of different categories there, right? Striving for your best,
Yeah.
mistakes or failure, losses, and then anxiety. Is there some uh yeah, strategies that you have or have developed that people would be able to use in those cases, or is it just sort of different frames of mind or different approaches that you encourage people to develop around those areas?
Yeah, I think I do individually. Like, I see what is it around performance that they are more afraid of, and
Mm,
come up with strategies specific to that particular individual.
mm,
Because somewhere I think that works better, because for some people the performance anxiety is very high, also because they're afraid of losing.
mm,
Because when they lose, they really don't know how to deal with themselves emotionally. You know, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of grief that they have to handle. So I don't think they like the way they become, especially when they lose. So
mm.
probably around that, the strategy would be quite different. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and probably sometimes what happens is anxiety is also happening quite a bit there, because they have not differentiated between what is the mistake that they are making and who they are as a person. Sometimes what
Mm,
they do is, they kind of associate themselves as a mistake. Like,
mm,
I am bad. They internalize that particular mistake. So then in that case, the strategy will be quite different in terms of, seeing what is a mistake and who they are as a person. Because sometimes what happens is also the fact that, they think that mistake is way bigger than them.
mm,
Yeah. So then they don't have power over, managing the mistakes. So in those situations, handling the mistakes
mm.
and looking at mistakes can be in a very different way, rather than, looking at it in a good or a bad way.
I'm curious, right? And this is a little bit of my own understanding, and maybe it takes our conversation in a different direction. I don't know. But I'm hearing, so maybe to tie the things that you've just spoken about to sort of what we spoke about a little bit earlier, right? So there's this idea that we learn from our parents, and
Mm-hmm.
or we could be learning our parents, either way. And a lot of the time we get taught
I
these
like that.
ideas.
We are learning our parents, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. And
She,
hey, my son has taught me a lot of things. I always say he's been my greatest teacher. um, but a lot of it is sort of based around that there are these principles in life, that there's good and there's bad, and
Mm,
there's right behavior and wrong behavior. And so if I'm failing or I'm making a mistake, then I'm not doing the good.
mm,
And so I at times feel like in my work, and I don't know how you think about this, is that I try and I feel like it's difficult. I don't think it's easy, because a lot of these ideas and principles are so deeply ingrained,
mm,
that I try and eradicate the understanding of good and bad, and sort
mm,
of not necessarily right and wrong in the sense of I can just show up in a team and I can be anywhere I want to be. There's no good and bad behavior, say, in a team environment, but more just the idea around maybe at a not maybe like at a simplistic level around thinking of my thoughts as good and bad or right and wrong, or my
mm,
emotions as good and bad and right and wrong, and that more saying, well, they're all welcome and they all serve a specific purpose, right?
mm,
As an example, last week I spoke with a cricketer, and he was sort of, and he's busy, he was sort of expressing to me how he's now in a space where he's being paid to play.
mhm,
And to sort of what the all of a sudden now there's these things in his head, right, around, oh shucks, but am I going to score enough runs? They're paying me all this money. How's this going to play out? Like, I should be doing more. Am I doing enough? And so then he calls that thinking, he labels it as negative, right? Like, this is negative thinking. And
mm,
so my suggestion was sort of like, let's not think of it as negative, right? Rather that's just naturally what your brain does. And it's more a case of because to me, all thoughts and emotions have some positive effect in them.
Mm.
Their intention isn't necessarily negative. So rather than seeing the thoughts as something that we don't want, to say, okay, these are the thoughts I'm busy having right now, and I
Mhm.
can understand maybe, or do my best to understand why I'm having them. So maybe it's because it is important this to me, right? Maybe because I don't want to fail. Maybe because I want to do well. Maybe because I want to have a career. Okay, cool. So these thoughts are appearing because there's all this other stuff that's actually important. And so I'm not labeling that thought as positive or negative. I'm rather labeling it as the thought I'm having at this point in time. And then when it comes to performance, I can shift my focus. I can decide, am I going to focus and go into a performance with all of that thinking playing through my mind, or am I going to focus on watching the ball?
Mm.
And so I don't know what your sort of take is on that.
I think, I agree with you in terms of, the brain is doing everything possible to help this person to deal with, whatever the pressure, the stress, etc., right, that is coming up. And I feel that, during the most stressful times, during the most painful times, there are parts of us which are not really healed, which take over, definitely. And they are doing their best to help us deal with that particular situation. I think if you look at it that way, it's any part within us is welcome.
Mm,
Any thought, any emotion that is coming up is definitely welcome.
mm,
So rather than like the way you mentioned that labeling them as good or bad, I think it's important for us to include everything, into a performance. Because the more you exclude, they definitely have control over us.
mm.
And, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's sort of something, an important point that you raised there. That's always been my sense, that as soon as I tell a thought personally, I don't want to, it's almost like it comes back harder. It
Yeah.
lingers longer. It sort of just sits there and eats away at you versus saying, okay, well, there's this thought, and well, it's there. I can't change that. Then it tends to lessen the effect of that thought. Or
Absolutely.
that's at least my experience of it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's like when you make one decision, the other thought says maybe you should have done this, etc., etc. So
Mm,
basically, I think it's okay. Like supporting all the thoughts which are coming in your head is also okay. Rather
mm,
than thinking that, yeah, this is the only direction, I have to be like good and make only this decision. And there's other part which is pulling you apart and saying that, what, this is not the right way to go.
mm.
I think allowing that the path to exist, even if you don't want to go this way, I think it's okay, not being very judgmental. Being curious about, okay, what is it that is actually stopping you? Um, I
Mm.
think it's very interesting to explore them the way they are.
Yes, yes. Do you think, and I wouldn't know, right? Because I think you're in India and there is a lot of meditation, there's a lot of more spirituality, there's a lot of focus, I think, within, at least my understanding, right? General
Yeah,
life for most people, or a
yeah.
lot of people in India, where the the thinking around the thoughts and emotions is like this. In South Africa, meditation, as an example, is frowned upon in certain parts of the
Mm,
community, like especially
mm, right.
from a Christian point of view. And
Oh,
and
okay.
and the Christian religion makes up a large portion of our country, right?
Okay.
So meditation isn't necessarily um, the idea of noticing your thoughts, being aware of them, or maybe a mindfulness practice isn't something that's so openly encouraged. It's more, I
Mhm.
think, up to individuals to almost like discover that for themselves. Having said that, right, there is still, and again, I might have this completely wrong. It's my perception that within the Indian community, there's still, even though there is maybe potentially a deeper understanding of the inside of a person, there's still the pressures. There's still, we see sort of still see parents putting pressure. We still see kids going through that. So even though they have this potential spiritual practice from a performance point of view, they're, I don't know if they've connected the two well enough at times yet. I don't know, right? I don't know what your experience is
Mhm.
with that versus saying,
Mhm.
well, performance isn't, just this hard thing that I've got to go and deliver on. It's actually part of, in the same way that as a person I am more holistic, like we mentioned a little bit earlier. Performance is actually also holistic. It's still the person that does the performance.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because I mean, yes, of course, there's a lot of yoga, there's meditation which we encourage. In fact, even athletes practice quite a lot of meditation for themselves. But having said that, uh, you know, I think there are multiple things which are happening in India also. Like, although we have such great roots when it comes to spirituality and, we have a lot of tradition uh, that we've gained. But yet, there is a lot of movement towards, okay, maybe this is not the only way. I would want to go and explore other things also towards handling my performance to a very large extent. Um, so that is also happening. And probably, I think, and also when you look at psychology, it being very scientific, a lot of people would not want to mix things up. So it's like, yeah, you keep your spirituality away from psychology. So that also happens. Although there are people who integrate it, but there is also a very different way to look at spirituality and psychology.
Okay.
So, means.
I've never thought of it like that because for me, I suppose for me, they were always integrated. The one sort of helps the other. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think like the way you're saying, spiritual way of life is really wonderful. And if athletes can inculcate that in their everyday practice, it's really beautiful. And of course, some of the athletes speak about the fact that they also get strengths from probably probably from certain gods, goddesses. Getting that kind of energy is also something that helps them with their performance to a very large extent.
Yeah. What actually put me onto these sort of thoughts and ideas around performance and the spirituality is a cricketer that I worked with. Sorry. And at the time, he mentioned to me, so he meditates quite a lot for a South African, I would say. So it's like a daily practice for him. And he said to me one day, he said, Jody, when I bat at my best, I feel like I'm meditating. The experience is very similar. I'm very in the present. Things are sort of just happening around me. I'm not really trying to do anything or achieve anything. And so I sort of never thought of it until he mentioned that, right? That you can actually integrate. We do this work and then you integrate it into your performance. And even psychology to a certain extent. I think we're really good at, and this is my perception, that we silo things, right? I go to my psychologist, or I go to my mental coach, and I do my mental work, and then I go to my performance. But it's like they're living in separate worlds. And I've maybe got my religion or my spirituality, and that's something that's separate. And I've got my family, and that's something separate. Where my sense is, if we almost like bring, as you said, I think you gave a good example there, where you bring maybe your god or goddesses, or you bring your parents, or you bring your the things you learn at your meditation, and you bring all of that into performance. I think my perception is you actually enhance your ability to perform. Because you're bringing more to the table. You're bringing more to the table, not just a skill set, not just an ability to hit a ball or throw a ball. You're bringing all of you to the table rather than just the part,
Yeah, I really like that. And honestly speaking, I do resonate with, your athlete, because a lot of times, especially when I am working with athletes, I do feel it's like a meditative experience because you are present with the person. And, somewhere there's a lot of intuitive power which also comes to you, especially when you're working with athletes. I think trusting and trusting that particular intuition is also very important, because then you are really present with your athletes, and it's a very beautiful experience in itself.
Yeah.
I mean, we call it flow state, we call it multiple things, we call it meditative state, but ultimately you do feel good in those states.
No, sorry, you can continue. You can finish.
Yeah, I think that state also comes when there is a lot of surrender and there is a lot of, you know, you've bowed down to what is actually happening, and there's a lot of gratitude. Um, you know,
I,
so
I love that. You bow down to what's happening.
yeah,
I love that
yeah,
because and that idea of surrendering to the moment rather than trying to control the moment or
yeah,
yeah
yeah.
be the boss in the moment. It's almost like accepting. An accepting to it, right?
Hmm.
And those, I think that ability to do that, a lot of athletes might perceive that as being weak, right? The word
Hmm.
surrender in itself says I give up.
Hmm.
Where I think in performance that is the strength, right? It is so I'm so secure in myself, I'm so okay within myself, my ego is so at peace potentially that this moment is not going to define who I am, and so I can actually just bow down and honor the moment and be grateful for it rather
Yeah,
than
absolutely.
feeling. I love that idea. I'm sort of thinking in my head how I can get teams to almost like understand that, or athletes to understand that you bow down to the moment, you honor it, and you respect it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same, even with your families for that matter, it's very important for us to bow down to our parents
Mm,
and feel them. Like for example, if I tell you that just imagine that, your parents are within you,
mm,
especially for an athlete who's actually struggling with anxiety or feeling that, I don't know whether I'm going to do well enough. Just telling him that just imagine the support of your parents within me.
mm,
There's a lot of difference when he's just trying to think that I have to carry all this burden all by myself.
mm,
And, thinking about the fact that imagine that there's a lot
mm,
of people out there who are supporting you.
mm.
And some people, probably imagine their parents supporting them or their grandparents, siblings, etc. When they feel that they are with them, the kind of performance happens is at a very different levels.
Yeah, yeah, that's true, right? Because then it's not just me standing on my own here on the field.
Hmm.
I actually had a client I worked with a few years ago, and one of the things that happened in his life at that time is his grandfather passed away.
Hmm.
And his grandfather always used to be in a very specific part of the cricket field in his mind, right? Most probably it wasn't always
Yeah.
at the exact same place, but in his
Hmm.
head, like if I'm batting, my grandfather is always sort of in this corner over my left shoulder. And all of a sudden, he felt like that was empty.
Yeah.
And because he felt that it was empty, his performances actually deteriorated.
Yeah.
And that was something that was physically happening. There was a figure always next to the field, and now the figure is not there anymore. And so we sort of did a similar type of exercise where it was about, um, kind of like imagining or building an understanding into his brain that the grandfather is still there in some
Yeah.
capacity. Maybe he's not next to the field anymore, and I think what he sort of went with is on top of me. He sees his grandfather on top of him, sort of in heaven, looking down every time he plays. And then obviously performance started picking back up again. So I call this, and maybe it's not the greatest words, but I suppose you could call it a level of visualization. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
visualizing something to be there. You generate the feeling or the emotion so that you can then perform from that place, right? Or you got that added sort of resource with you. Versus, also I call it rather we're tricking our mind, because I think that's the great ability of our mind, that it has this pliable ability that we can mess with it a little bit. And I suppose sometimes we can mess with it and it harms us. But I think if you can use it in such a way that you can trick it into having an understanding or having a belief or having a concept that serves your performance, then why not use it at the end of the day?
Yeah, I agree with you, and they're always with us. The memories, the kind of support, it's never gone,
Mm,
definitely. Even if they have to die, I think we still carry a lot of memories and that love that they've had for us.
yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
and what you did was very nice with your athlete.
Thank you. Well, it was his idea, to be fair. I just asked the questions at the time. I was like, okay, well, he's not here anymore. So what do you want to do with that? And he was like, no, I need
Yeah.
to sort of create some sense of that he's watching. Okay, cool. And then off we went, off we went. Tell
Yeah, and
me,
also if he ends up thinking that he's no longer there, physically no longer present, and he can't have access to him at all, then he'll only be grieving that loss, right? But here I think you brought in a lot of support, strength, you know, and the
yeah,
memories of the grandfather, which is really nice.
yeah. So I'd like to think about performance that the way I normally explain it to athletes is that your performance is like a cocktail, right? There's
Hmm.
like a mix that you throw into a cocktail glass that you would shake. And so
Right.
sometimes if you make a cocktail and the mix is a bit off, it doesn't taste, if there's too much alcohol in there, or if it's not an alcoholic cocktail, there's too much strawberry in it, or there's too much of some flavor in it, then it's not the same, right? And so I think our
Wow.
challenges from a performance point of view is to get our cocktail as regularly and consistently in that place where performance can flow from. And I think
Yeah.
you mentioned flow a little bit earlier. And so I think a lot of athletes, or my experience rather, is that a lot of athletes, they're they're not aware of the cocktail they're creating.
So,
So they kind of just do their practice, show up at performance, and kind of hope it works. Versus an
um,
understanding to maybe say, shucks, I perform better when I feel like my grandfather's with me. Like that's
yeah,
an ingredient that goes into your cocktail. That's an
nice.
ingredient that maybe needs to be in your individual cocktail for your performance, that your grandfather played such a significant part that you've got to take him with you mentally into every performance.
Yeah.
An ingredient might be a breathing strategy. An ingredient
Um,
might be very clear on your intention, or where you're going to score, or how you're going to play against that opponent. A ingredient could be how you're feeling in that performance, and so I don't know if enough athletes do enough work on that to understand what their cocktail is. They do the physical
mm,
work, they go to the gym, but they don't get to deeply understand their cocktail uh, that they need for performance. They sort of
yeah.
hope that they'll wake up and it'll be there, you know.
Yes. I think it also brings in the humanness, right, around performance. So from what you've spoken, I think it really adds a lot of our own humanness, our own vulnerabilities, especially when we have to bring that to our performance, then it's phenomenal.
Mm.
Then you're definitely able to surrender, to the
Yes.
moment the way it is, because you're not really afraid of the outcome, because you know that you're supported. And you're playing at a very different level of strength altogether, rather than
Mm.
just looking at things as like, oh, I have to go do this. You're
Mm.
not looking at it as a job, but you're there in a
Mm.
very different level. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this conversation, eh? I like sort of
Mhm.
how through the conversation, I've sort of just created this awareness for myself that you can bring more to the party in performance. You can show up with more than just your skills. So why would an athlete who does all this work? This is my question I'm sort of coming with
Mhm.
from this conversation. Why, if you're doing all of this work, would you want to just all the work that you do? So let's take a cricketer, and I know I can't speak for cricketers all around the world. Say the cricketers in South Africa. Why would they go spend so many hours in the nets hitting cricket balls,
Yeah.
bowling balls, working on their technique, trying to understand their technical game, and then they only want to show up in performance with just that? When
And
they have within them all the resources that, if they learn to tap into them, to bring so much more to performance than just a skill set. You can bring with you every experience you've had, every memory, everything that serves you or helps you in a performance, every emotion, every thought, every understanding. And I think, like you said, if you can do that, if you come with all of that, then you maybe realize that you're not defined by the performance, and so then it becomes easier, and you're not the performance, you're not sort of connected with it from identity point of view. Then it becomes easier to surrender to it, to bow before it, to be grateful for it.
and
But I think because we just go with a skill set, then I've got to define myself with my skills, just with this raw stuff. And then it's easy to go, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure. Because
yes.
Some days they're good, some days they're bad, or they're at the level that you've trained them to. And sometimes you play against stronger opposition, sometimes you play against weaker opposition. And so if that becomes your measure of you, then I think you're setting yourself up for a very tough time.
Yeah, definitely. I think I really like the way you've summed it up because you brought in the aspects of performance. You also brought in, like I said, a lot of human qualities and our own life experiences, which gives us the strength to go out there and perform rather than just thinking that, I'm my score. I'm the number of runs I score or the number of wickets I get. That's not who we are, isn't it? I think it's really time to define athletes way more than their performance.
Yeah. I know I summarized it, but it's all you, right? It's all your ideas in this conversation that sort of has led me to this understanding, if I can say it like that, right? And I think that's the beauty for me of these conversations is that all the podcasts I've recorded, that at some level I'm gaining from them, and the people that are listening are hopefully gaining something from us having this conversation. And that's the reason I do this. The primary reason I do this is I have a great conversation, and I can then say, hey, listen to this, and other people can learn from that, or maybe it helps them have a great conversation with somebody else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And here, I think in your podcast right now, the way we are conversing, there's so much safety, there's freedom, and there's no pressure that I have to speak things a certain way. I think these are the most important things, even when it comes to performance, isn't it?
Yeah.
For us to connect to ourselves at such a deep level and creating a very safe environment within ourselves so that we know that when we go out there and perform, it's really safe for us.
Yeah, so we could create sort of then our own safety within the safety of our family, hopefully within the safety of our larger community of family. Maybe we don't get to see our grandparents that often, but we know they're there. They might stay far away. We go visit them, within the maybe safety of our friendships. And so I think what I've learned in this conversation is certainly that within all of that, we have this unique opportunity from a performance point of view to make things about more than just the performance, and I think when we can spend time understanding people, and when we can spend time not just understanding but almost bring their stuff into our environment, right? So and this is a new idea or concept for me in itself, right? Is that from this conversation that I think in team type stuff, you would often think, okay, well, let's sit down and we talk a little bit about what we want, where we want to go. Where if you could almost like not just bring an understanding, but you bring the actual stuff in there, you get the family members to come into the team environment and meet each other. Like something like that could be way more powerful.
Absolutely. And I think when in the team environment, when players actually learn about each other's family, when they get, to see this side of the players, because not everybody comes with a very, happy family environment, right? We all come with a lot of traumas. There are so many things which every athlete would have faced individually, and they bring that to the team. So when other players see that and appreciate that in terms of this is the way they are, and I think this is what makes him the person he is. And this is the way that, he or she, this particular athlete, deals with life's challenges. I think, they really become a team to a very large extent, rather than just working as individuals and thinking that, he's this, he's that, etc. Rather than making judgment, it really unites them as individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sure. It feels like we've come a little bit full circle to a certain extent, which normally happens in this conversation. We sort of started off with the parenting, looking at the parenting, we went into performance, and now we're sort of ending up in a place where, hey, if you want to enhance performance, you could actually bring the parents into the performance, into teams. And maybe it's not like a direct link like that. Okay, well, let's get all the parents in here. But I think we can be creative around maybe say things like that and open up opportunities within teams to explore the people within our team beyond just the performance that they have to deliver. that there's other parts and other facets to them, and we can almost learn to bow to each other first, and sort of accept and appreciate and be grateful for each other, even though we could be so different. Like, I imagine in the IPL, you could have a Buddhist playing with a Hindu, playing with a Christian, playing with a Muslim. Like, you know, you can have, if you think from a religious point of view, you could have all these different religions. You could have an uber wealthy person playing with somebody who's had like a really tough upbringing and has really, like, you know, lived on the streets, but they've developed their cricket skill and now they're in a place. And I think there's a story like that. I think it's Gaikwad or somebody like that, one of those players from India that have really come out of poverty. And so I think there's a lot to be said then, right, around our conversation today, this understanding that we can, there's more to the game than just the performance. And if we can make more of that part of what we do, then hopefully we get better performance, you know?
Absolutely. I agree with him.
Yeah. Sure. I'm curious if there was anything in specific that you would have wanted to cover in this conversation, or that you thought it would be great to mention to people from your point of view, you know?
I think I just want to say that, you know, when we end up taking the right place in our family, we kind of get a lot of strength. We don't carry the burden. That's one of the things that I just want to say to everybody. And apart from that, I think we also derive a lot of strength when we come into the right space in the order of the family. Like, as children, when we know that we are children, taking that right space also helps us take the right space in the teams that we work with.
Okay.
You know, then the dynamic, you know, like, then the dynamic can be very different, you know. Otherwise, what happens is, even in the teams, like I previously mentioned, you know, I may relate to my teammate as one of the parent. You know, I may get very scared of some of them. I would want to boss around some of them, etc., etc. So then that aspect really will not happen to that extent, because you're treating everybody with a lot of competence and with a lot of knowing that they're capable of helping the team. Then we make more resilient teams. So yeah, this is something that I would like to say.
So it's like play the right role at the right time. Like,
Absolutely.
Like, in a family, I am the child, so that is my role. Yeah. So then I can go into a team and hopefully then more easily say, okay, what's my role here? My role here is to be the junior, to be learning. If I get opportunities, I use them and I take them. My role is to be the leader in this team. Okay, cool, I can step into that. And so whatever the role then is, that we're not taking on responsibilities and things that's not meant for us, essentially, because we're able to stand within our role and then do that to the best of our ability. That's sort of what I'm getting from what you're saying.
Yeah, and also the fact that sometimes, you know, athletes may also think that the coach is incapable. So when you do that, then the hierarchy is not really followed, isn't it? So, you know, to learn from
that can happen a lot.
Yeah. So for the athlete to know his role, and also to understand that the coach has his position in the team, and for him to respect the coach for who he is and the kind of power he brings in, then he will not be meddling with the coach's role and his responsibilities. And I look at it more from the family perspective, in terms of the family dynamic happening here.
Yeah. Brilliant. I think that's a great sort of awareness to have, and like, am I doing the thing that I'm meant to be doing? And as a coach, I can't go play for cricketers. And in my own mind, I'm very clear on that. Like, your success is not dependent on me. I'm responsible for coaching you and providing the training environment. And so if we fall short in performance, I can look at that. I can look at what I can control. Am I providing the training and things like that equips players to go on to the field for performance? And I think if players then want to step into the coach's shoes and say, well, you're not adequate at what you're doing, or think that you're not doing the right stuff, then they're not busy taking on their responsibility, which is I got to make sure that I train properly. And if I'm not, or if the environment is maybe not providing it for me, then I've got to either go do extra or I've got to engage with a coach,
Right.
or whatever it might be. And so I like that. I like that as a sort of an idea that athletes can say, what is my role? What is it? And I think sometimes they wait for coaches to give it to them. And some coaches just don't, where maybe they can say, well, in a family, I think you could say I'm the child, because that's your role. So you could technically actually define your own role if it doesn't come. And so, okay, well, I'm a number 5 batter, or I'm a left wing, or whatever it might be. And so that is my role. That's my position. So I'm going to do that to the best of my understanding of that position. And within the dynamic of the team, maybe I'm the junior, or maybe I'm the guy that must bring the energy, because I must actually step up in that space. I'm the guy here that naturally has a bit of energy, so I'm going to claim that role for myself, and then I'm going to run with that as an example, rather than waiting for somebody to tell you to do that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Priyanka, this has been fun. I've enjoyed this conversation, and it's certainly opened my sort of thinking and understanding to a couple of new things, as I said in the conversation. And I think in particular that you can come to the game with more than just your skill set, and that idea of bowing, and surrendering to the moment rather than try and force it or control it. Like, that's certainly the two things for me that stood out from this conversation. I want to know if you're open to it. If people want to reach out to you or get in contact, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, probably my website.
Okay.
I mean, I could share that with you. And yeah.
Perfect. I'll make sure it's in the notes below the podcast.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe. It's such a wonderful conversation with you.
Perfect. I also enjoyed it. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye. Take care.
Cool.